All
Okay,
right.
everybody, welcome back to Doomer Optimism. We have a little bit of a relaxed schedule this summer, which is good and fun. So we're just intermittently releasing episodes, but I have here Dana Fisher. Dana, I've heard her name a bunch. I'm trained as an environmental sociologist with my PhD, so I'm on these environmental sociology listservs. So I see Dana's name a lot because she's in this kind of milieu. And she wrote this book called Saving Ourselves from Climate Shocks to Climate Action, which is here and in her background as well. And so we decided to have a chat about the book. I think part of it too was when the book first came out, we interacted a little on Twitter about, this kind of idea of optimism with regard to climate change. And so this whole podcast is called Doomer Optimism. So I think maybe part of the conversation could be me introducing myself too to you, and you to my listeners and viewers. So let's start, Dana, and have you introduce yourself, and then let's talk about the book.
Great. Hi, I'm Dana Fisher. Currently, I'm the director of the Center for Environment, Community, and Equity and a professor in the School of International Service at American University. I am a born and bred sociologist, and I do a lot of work in the environmental arena. I'm also the author of Saving Ourselves from Climate Shocks to Climate Action. And in contrast to being a doomer optimist, I call myself an apocalyptic optimist. And I think that's how we originally started chatting, is that the first excerpt of the book when it came out was actually this section of the book called Making a Case for Apocalyptic Optimism. So I think that that's where this whole thing started. I can say a little more about my background if that's helpful, but maybe that's enough. I don't
Yeah,
know.
that's good. Let's actually start with this um term, apocalyptic optimism. You can define that and maybe explain it a bit, and then I can maybe counter with what is doomer optimism and how did it come about. So yeah, tell me about apocalyptic optimism.
So apocalyptic optimism is basically it builds off of the notion from the work that I've been doing. So the past 25 years, my career, I started out studying climate policy making in the 1990s. So I started working on climate as a sociologist back when most sociologists were not looking at climate. And I did my dissertation, my first book were around the Kyoto Protocol, which was back when we thought we were going to save the world with one treaty that was legally binding. And well, now it's, 20, I believe it's like 25 years later, right? More than that now, actually, but not since the treaty went into legal force, entered into legal force. But whatever the case, I call myself an apocalyptic optimism because I believe that we can save ourselves from the climate crisis, but I believe that to do that, we need to recognize some unfortunate truths, and we need to get comfortable with the unfortunate truths of the climate crisis, which is that it's bad, it's getting worse. Nothing we have done so far has gotten us anywhere near where we need to be with regard to addressing the climate crisis. That means that emissions continue to go up, concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere continue to go up. And we are increasingly seeing the effects of that in our everyday lives in the form of what I call in the book climate shocks, which actually the media also calls climate shocks, but nobody ever defined it until my book. So now I have a definition in the book about what a climate shock is. And so the apocalyptic part is that climate shocks are hitting us more frequently and with more severity and will continue to do so as concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere continue to go up, which they
Mhm.
will, because even those countries that had aggressive commitments with regard to addressing or at least capping their CO2 emissions and greenhouse gas emissions, almost none of them have met them. So basically, we have all these folks saying they're going to do something, businesses as well. Nobody's gotten there. So as a result, we have to be realistic and prepare for what's coming. And we're already seeing it with this, summer of heat domes, et cetera, extreme events, et cetera. I'm an optimist, though, so I'm apocalyptically optimistic because I don't think it's too late. I do not think we should be sitting and feeling overwhelmingly depressed or despondent because the climate crisis is upon us and we're living in a warming world. Instead, I am confident and optimistic about the role of people power in working to mobilize the masses to push back against oppression, to push back against those who have privileged access to power in terms of natural resources, as well as power in terms of elected officials, to actually get us where we need to go. So I believe in people power, and what the book does is it lays out kind of the blueprint for how we're going to get there and what's needed, because we're nowhere near still. And really, the big question that I ask in the book is, how bad is it going to have to get before people rise up and push back?
Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, so basically the doomer optimism is like a very, very similar or like sister kind of concept. So this podcast kind of rose out of to me and another friend, Jason Snyder, who's a lecturer at Appalachian State University. We're both like kind of in food systems research, and basically kind of acknowledging the fact that there are environmental crises, and we broaden it beyond just climate, but to environmental crises more broadly, but then also just like spiritual crises, the crisis of meaning, the crisis of community, belonging, all of these things. So recognizing all these various crises is the doomer part, and then the optimism part is, well, what do you do about it, and how do you not get stuck? And I think part of my evolution over the past couple of years doing this podcast has been really asking the specific question of like, how did you come to whatever doom it is you perceive? How do you process that? It's almost like the stages of grief. And then how do you move beyond it to like acceptance, and then, resilience in the face of that? And I think part of the reason this podcast started is what I had was a very strong critique of environmentalism specifically, which is many times, and you already mentioned it, like almost leaning into like the depression or the crisis mentality of like, you can't think straight if you're in a crisis. You can't really like assess and be rational about it. You just think like, we have no time, we have to do something drastic, and then that leads to some weird outcomes, in my opinion. So let's talk about that first, just like how people are like wrapping their heads around the doom, and what are like more and less useful ways to do that.
Well, so I'm not a social psychologist, so I don't focus particularly on doom or anxiety. And there are some really good books around climate doomism, but more even around climate anxiety that have come
Mhm.
out. The way that I look at it in my work is, so a lot of the research I do focuses on climate activists. I mean, I study activism broadly, but in the book and across my career, I've studied climate activism since 2000 was the first time I went out and surveyed protesters, and I did it at the climate negotiations in The Hague, which was called COP6 bis. Um, and um, and I've been surveying climate protesters and climate activists around the world since then, many times. And in the book, I bring in multiple waves of data. What I have done recently, and this does connect to this question about doom and the way that people are experiencing it, and how it connects with the climate crisis, is that recently, when I started looking specifically at activism on climate, you know, well, let me say this a different way. And you're not editing this at all, are you? So
No,
it's
probably not, unless
all right.
there's you ask.
No,
Yeah,
no, 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 no.
yeah.
It's fine. I'm cool with it. Let me say this a different way. So last spring, not last spring, last fall, there was the UN Secretary General called together uh, countries to meet in New York City in what he called the Climate Ambition Summit, which is basically, one of the UN Secretary General's many Hail Marys where he's tried to finally get countries to get in line and actually follow through on their commitments and actually implement what they say they're going to implement and meet the commitments of their nationally determined commitments that are part of the Paris Agreement. So we had this meeting. You had to all the countries had to have their specific plans in place to be allowed to come in. The United States was not invited, by the way, because we weren't there. But that's an aside. Right before that, there was a protest. Frequently around these UN meetings, there are big protests. So this was the largest climate protest that had happened since January 6th and since the Biden administration took office. And so, first of all, after January 6th, lots of people didn't want to protest, but also when Democrats take the White House, we frequently see a substantial reduction in protests in the streets. But a lot of the data that I use in my research is around protesters and activists. So I wanted to go out to the big march. There were 75,000 people in the streets in New York. It was called the March to End Fossil Fuels. At that event, because of these questions about climate anxiety, climate doomism, etc., I decided to add a question to my survey. So I adapted the survey that I've been using for many years and added to it a question about the emotions that people are feeling as a result of climate change. And so I brought in the list of emotions that have been surveyed in some of these other big surveys out of the folks from Yale and et cetera. And I asked people about it. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting and is consistent with some other literature around protest activism and climate activism was that the two most common emotions that people were feeling around climate change, of those activists who were in the streets, was sadness and anger. Anger was at the top of the list. And it's really interesting when we think about people's responses to climate change, people who are feeling climate anxiety, people who are feeling overwhelmed by this sense of doom, right? And we all feel it from time to time. But for me, my answer and the way that I've talked about it a lot is that one of the things that we see is that when people get angry and they start to think about the systemic reasons why we're experiencing the climate crisis and environmental, like cascading crises that we're experiencing today, a lot of people get angry when they start to feel that way. And the beauty of anger is that it has this sense of efficacy and it actually pushes to action so that we see people mobilize and coordinate and engage in collective behavior much more effectively. So one of my big messages is, don't feel anxiety. I mean, like, obviously we're going to feel it sometimes, but get angry about the inequities that we're experiencing and the reasons why we as the general public are being, forced to push back against power because power is not actually taking care of this mess on its own, even though it should be.
Yeah. So yeah, that's interesting. And your specific area is talking to activists specifically. So, but yeah, and our critique early on is I think not just activists, but in general, like just the whole discourse around climate is that it can feel very overwhelming. I think part of specifically the climate issue tends to lead to this it's a very abstract and gigantic problem. And so sometimes that can lead to a kind of anger that then is hard to direct towards some specific action. There's a collective action, there's protesting, but then there's like a sort of disconnect because it's almost like when you see the problem, you're like, this is a global problem. It's so hard to come up with a very like neat and actionable solution. It's literally like change the whole structure of our society to not be around fossil fuels. And so part of the point of our podcast is to give people a little steps, easily actionable steps, even if it's literally just starting a garden and learning how nature works and paying attention to things around you, which then can scale up. And that's part of what my dissertation research was about, was people who some very far left, but some very far right, who produce their own food, but did it in a way as to kind of build an ecological understanding and build a relationship with nature in like the subsistence way. And then that kind of scales. So anyways, that's kind of an aside. Where do you stand? Do you follow Jem Bendell at all?
I'm not sure I know her.
Oh, it's him. He's
Oh,
a British
so
he's a
then no, I
British
guess
no,
not. The
yeah.
answer is
So
no.
he's a British academic who
What has he written?
he wrote this thing a while back called Deep Adaptation, and it became a point of contention among more like I think British climate discussions, but basically the idea was that we are so far gone. At a certain point we need to be thinking about not just mitigation but adaptation to the already existing climate changes and changes to our whole ecology because that it is so far gone. And a lot of people, there was just a lot of debate at the time. I think this was like maybe 10 years ago about you're giving up by talking about adaptation. And so I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on like this adaptation versus mitigation
Oh,
question,
sure. I mean, so I guess it worth noting here is that, I mean, one of the motivations behind writing this book is I was one of the contributing authors for the IPCC's most recent assessment report. I contributed to Working Group 3 which is on mitigation, and I wrote a new section. So for the first time, the IPCC included a section talking about civic engagement and civic activism as part of the assessment, which is
Mhm.
great. But I have been working in the climate world for many, many years, and I have done work on adaptation as well as mitigation. In fact, I'm currently working with a number of agencies under the Biden administration specifically to look at how they can expand out their climate core so that it can address what we're calling now in our work the 4 R's of climate work, which integrate both adaptation and mitigation. I don't see it, and I do a lot of work with folks who do adaptation style work, although I have studied the politics of mitigation for much of my career and have written a couple of books and numerous papers about it. But I actually think of it as a spectrum. And we have a paper that we're launching on a week from Monday with AmeriCorps, who's funding this research, specifically about thinking about these different components of climate work, which integrate both of them. It's
Oh, yeah.
impossible at this point to think about this as like a dichotomy. It's not an
Yep.
and or, it's not an or, it's an and. And it is, we need to lean really hard into the adaptation side. In our work, we actually talk about this, and this is based on having done extensive interviews with leaders of Climate Corps that are nationally happening across the country, including those involved in the American Climate Corps, that the best way to think about climate work is to break it into what we call the 4 R's,
I would
which
love to hear what those are. Yeah.
here are the 4 R's. The paper will be out a week from Monday.
We get the
It's launching.
scoop.
Yeah, so here's the scoop is that the 4 R's are reduction, which is reduction to concentrations of um greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. So that can be either through reduction of emissions or technologies that are used or nature-based solutions that are used to reduce concentrations, such as, planting trees, right? But that's actually a very small part of the kind of work that people are doing today. And actually the rest of it, and that's the mitigation side. The other side of this is what is under the basket of adaptation, and that includes resilience, which is preparedness for climate exacerbated events and disruptions, response, which is response to climate exacerbated events and disruptions, or recovery, and recovery to climate exacerbated events and disruptions. And the idea here is, like, I recognize some people talk about resilience in a different way, but when we talk about it within the context of the type of work that Service Corps are doing, they actually are distinguishing between that work that is preparing before an event happens, right? And that's where they talk a lot about resilience. And that includes like all this food system expansion work, developing capacity around, school gardens, around making sure that there are food banks available. And then there is the response, which is after an extreme event hits, and then the recovery, which is basically preparing so that the next time it's not so bad. So it's like resilience post hoc.
Yeah.
So yeah, so that's the work that we're actually doing, and we look at examples across, since I'm working extensively with AmeriCorps, so we look across examples of the Service Corps programs there, and some of the most exciting and interesting stuff that they've been doing around, its climate work is really around you know, after Hurricane Katrina hit in New Orleans, where they developed a whole bunch of resilience mechanisms that are there for when the next hurricane hits, which hopefully will not be this year. And also they talk about how they were able to develop really like much more entrenched food systems in communities after Hurricane Maria hit in Puerto Rico. So there are some really exciting examples of this, and this is the work that I've been spending most of my time doing these days. So we
Hmm.
are actually about to start piloting, looking at using this curriculum to help train young people who are serving in these service corps so they understand better what's climate about the work they're doing. Because our preliminary work in 2022 now found that a lot of the people who serve come out of these programs saying, I signed up to do climate and I ended up mucking and gutting after a hurricane or after a wildfire, and I don't see how that's climate. And so we need to do a better job of explaining that. So that's
Yeah.
where the work
Okay.
is.
Oh my gosh, I have so much to say on this. First of all, I'm so glad that this is seen as a spectrum now and it's not like a either or. I mean, I even argued this was like, 10 years ago when this came out, but I was like, I mean, a lot of times when you're doing adaptation, it's also mitigation. Like if you're
Mm,
doing resilience of like building local food systems, that would also be a reduction in greenhouse gases. So
right.
I don't understand why the pushback to adaptation. I think part of it at the when this came out and it was kind of like a big deal in the UK was people were saying like, oh, you're giving up by turning to
Hmm.
adaptation as opposed to mitigation. And I'm like, these things can kind of go hand in hand and you can be realistic. I think a lot of people were saying like, no, we need to fight and not give in to the fact that like there is some, climate change is happening, but
Right.
it's better to not put your head in the sand. So I'm glad that that's like kind of buried, at least in your experience. Um, I'm so excited and to hear more. And I don't know how much you know or what the plans are, but for this AmeriCorps thing and the
You
climate
mean the
work.
American Climate Corps, right?
Yeah, well, were
So the
you saying?
American Climate Corps is not AmeriCorps. AmeriCorps is one of the agencies that is involved in the American Climate Corps, but the American Climate Corps coordinated through the White House.
Okay,
And
yeah, I want to hear more about that, but let me just say one thing first, which is part of what I did after I got my PhD is I lived for 7 years in Uruguay in South America, and I just came back to Chicago this past year, but I was there for 7 years running this study abroad program with different American universities where they came for like about a 10-day trip and worked with local agroecological food producers there. And so that comment you made about trying to connect what the work is in this kind of climate work to environmental issues was right in the core of what I was doing in those trips, because it was basically like, we're planting trees, we're pulling weeds, we're learning about like regenerative agricultural systems and rotational grazing systems that happen in Latin are expanding across Latin America. And then, we're doing all of this kind of stuff during the day. And then in the evenings, I would sit and talk environmental sociology to like
mhm.
connect the dots. Like, this is why they do it this way. Here's how it connects to like not only climate, but biodiversity and, ecological systems of agriculture and all this kind of stuff. So that is like my wheelhouse and I love it so much. So yeah, I would love to hear a little bit more about this American Climate Corps because it seems like right in the wheelhouse of the kinds of things I've heard about, but I don't know that much about. And it's like, it just all sounds very cool. I want to hear more about it.
Well, I mean, so let me connect it back to the book since we're here to talk about the book. I mean, so in the book, I end up talking about three things we all can do to help us save ourselves from the climate crisis. And when I say save ourselves, I don't mean we're going to solve the climate crisis, but rather get us to the other side of the climate crisis because it's going to take systemic change at all levels. And it's going to involve every single one of us doing whatever we're willing to do. And so
Mhm.
I talk about activism a lot, so we can go there later. So two of the suggestions at the end of the book are about activism and how we can do more effective activism. But the other one is for everybody, and it's actually about cultivating resilience in our communities. And when I talk about resilience, I mean resilience in terms of social and environmental resilience.
Mhm.
And actually, coming out of that part of the book, I started looking at what became the American Climate Corps, which when I started doing this right at the beginning of the Biden administration, right the beginning of the administration, I believe it was week one of the administration, Biden made an announcement that he was trying to build out what he at the time called a civilian climate corps, which had been put into the Build Back Better Act, which failed for a number of sad reasons, and didn't actually make it across the finish line. It was resurrected in part as the Inflation Reduction Act, which got passed 2 summers ago now. Was it 2 summers? Well, I guess it's like a summer ago. So it's been over a year at this point. No, actually, so it's almost 2 years, but it's not quite 2 years. Anyway, so the Inflation Reduction Act did not include the Civilian Climate Corps in it and was not funded as such. So there was no funding for a climate corps that came out of the federal government out of this legislation with which the president signed into law. Instead, last year in September, right around the time, right after the March 10 fossil fuels, which I was telling you about, where I collected these data about people's emotions and a bunch of other things who were engaging in activism right before this meeting at the United Nations, the Biden administration announced it was creating an American Climate Corps, where he basically said that they were going to create, well, the way that he described it is 20,000 jobs to work and put young people to work to address the climate crisis. Now, in reality, there was actually no funding to implement this project because the Inflation Reduction Act did not include it, and there was no other federal funding. And the way that the federal funding works is that it has to go through the US Congress. So the president cobbled together a program that includes a small number, and I mean small number, of new jobs and new programs, and instead rebrands numerous existing programs that are run by agencies across the US government. And those agencies include AmeriCorps, they include the US Department of Interior's National Park Service, other parts of Department of Interior, parts of the USDA, US Forest Service. Department of Energy is now involved too. So across all of these different agencies, there are programs that are being built out. Some of them are funded by the Inflation Reduction Act. Some of them are funded by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Framework. Some of them are funded by other initiatives that provided funding to do work around resilience, around environmental stewardship. And all of those programs are expanding out how they're focusing on climate and are being rebranded as part of the American Climate Corps. This summer, I guess so, like moving forward in time, on Earth Day, the president announced the launching of the American Climate Corps website, which basically just presents information coming from across the agencies in one place. And it's unclear to the degree to which that website will continue to be updated. And I think some of that will be determined by the outcome of the election in November. But what is interesting is that the administration started this summer swearing in people who were serving in these various corps that already existed and swearing them in as part of the American Climate Corps. So the American Climate Corps is a rebranding of existing programs, many of which have been doing increasingly more work around climate. And that's where I come in because I've been working with these different agencies under cooperative agreements with them to help them think through what's climate about what they're doing and how to do more effective climate and create metrics so that we can evaluate them more effectively. And that's what I've been doing with AmeriCorps. And this white paper that talks about the 4 R's of climate work, it's first launching as part of the results of research we've done with AmeriCorps. We will have a companion paper coming out of the National Park Service on the same subject. And then we'll be bringing it all together for a paper for peer review, but that's in the future. For now, the goal is for this to be a tool that these climate corps and these programs can use to help the young people who serve understand what they're doing and how it's connected.
Great. And bringing it back to the book, I just want to highlight the three clear recommendations, what we can do to build capacity to save ourselves. 1, create community. 2, capitalize on moral shocks, and 3, cultivate resilience. So definitely, I would say that's like the theme of this whole podcast. And so we talk about like the details of that, but this specific work that you're doing in the American Climate Corps, I had not followed this at all. So this is super interesting as like I've heard of people suggesting some kind of new kind of deal, new deals, environmental new deal, and like the Green New Deal was kind of a version of that, but build out infrastructure that's doing adaptation work and mitigation work. And so that's super cool that this is happening, that it's advancing. I know it's probably very small, but it's very cool that a lot of the these different agencies that are already doing adjacent type work are trying to understand it in terms of climate. Do you want to talk at all about the specifics of the type of work that's going on under these various programs, like planting trees you mentioned, but what
I think what I'd rather do, actually, just because we don't have that much time, is I think we should probably talk about the book. I mean, that this is a new project. I mean, I am, I've been working with this for a while. I'm happy to share the paper when it comes out. but it's separate to the book. I mean, what I mentioned here though is like the American Climate Corps is a very, it's an example of the way that folks can cultivate resilience, but it's certainly not the only way. And I think it's extremely important that it's embedded in folks' communities.
Yeah, why don't we
The
talk about what you have in mind for that? Because there's not a ton of detail here, just in terms of what you mean by creating community. So what did you have in mind in the book?
Well, so when I talk about creating community, I actually am specifically talking about climate activism. I mean, and so let me just kind of take a step back and say within the book, we kind of leapfrogged over to the end and the final suggestion here. But within the book, I talk through why it's going to take people power and civil society rising up and mobilizing the masses for us to get to the other side of the climate crisis by going through the history of the way that the climate regime was formed, climate policy making, and I build on a whole bunch of research that I've done as well as other people have done to talk through why we are where we are politically and why it's just absolutely insufficient to address the climate crisis. I also talk about the ways that businesses and economic interests are bipolar and not working together in an effective manner to address climate change. That is due to fossil fuels, as you mentioned, and the ways that what we in the IPCC we're required to call them the vested interests have privileged access to resources and power. And we see that quite clearly here. We're in an election year. Quite clearly, we can see the ways that folks in government are, basically under the thumb of the fossil fuel industry. I mean, I'm just thinking through President Trump just the nomination of the Republicans for trying, so he's trying to run for a second term in office. He did that yesterday, and during his speech, he talked about well, how he's going to make America great by exploiting our natural resources to expand fossil fuel production and send American fossil fuels all over the world. What's interesting
He
about
said drill baby drill.
I know he said Joe Belly, yeah, I mean, but he said a lot.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah.
but I would just say that prior to that, he actually is documented as having meetings with leaders of oil companies where he basically offered himself up to help them uh, realize their potential for expanding drilling. So basically, the whole deal is that there are a lot of companies that are making a lot of money off of fossil fuel expansion, and they are pushing back against the clean energy revolution and any companies that are pushing for a clean energy transition. So as a result, we need people power. And in the book, I talk about where we are with the climate movement, what we see in the climate movement in the United States. And I talk about the growing radical flank within the climate movement, which is engaging in more confrontational but still peaceful nonviolent civil disobedience right now. And I talk through what role they're playing in trying to push for more people to join the movement. And then I end by talking about these three points of suggestion for what we need to do to save ourselves. And the first one is about creating community. And there I've talked about creating community and true solidarity within the movement. So this is within the climate movement because historically, the climate movement has been extremely privileged, predominantly white, extremely highly educated, and the research that I've been doing all the way through this summer continues to replicate the findings that we've seen before. Colleagues I know who have done the same kind of research in other countries, particularly in advanced industrialized nations, find the exact same patterns, right?
Mhm.
So the climate movement needs to diversify. It needs to create intersectional ties with people with different identities, orientations, and backgrounds. And one of the things I talk specifically about is the way that the climate movement needs to connect with labor more effectively because it has not done so thus far.
Yeah, how do you see that playing out? Because I think part of I mean, you mentioned it in a couple of pages and said basically that there's not a ton of great examples of it working out very well. And
Yeah.
I think it's part of the whole impetus of this podcast is to try to bring people in who wouldn't necessarily be on paper political allies, but might be allies in terms of sharing a similar kind of ecological ethic, even if it's not necessarily climate, or sharing the same kind of ideas about what to do about various problems, even if we don't necessarily agree on the prescription.
Uh-huh.
And so I'm wondering, yeah, how do you see that playing out? Because I think there's plenty of examples of meeting people where they're at and not like forcing a political
Right.
perspective down their throat while also building solidarity. But it doesn't seem like there's a ton of examples of that working well within the climate movement.
No, for sure not. I mean, and one of the things that I do talk about in the book is the way that lots of folks in labor talk about this critique coming from climate activists about expansion of fossil fuels as being a real problem for labor. And part
Mhm.
of the reason for that is because if we look at the clean energy infrastructure, even to date in the United States, much of it is not powered by union labor, right? So if you look at most of the EV factories right now, they're not unionized. Tesla is not unionized. So if you want to be, if you're working in building cars and you want to be, you're in a union or you want to, work with a union and have, collective bargaining, et cetera, and so forth, you're going to go work for fossil fuel based cars, right? Those that burn oil, because then you get union labor, you get healthcare, you get et cetera, and so forth, get all those benefits. And until we see and support more, unionization across the whole sector, there's going to be a problem. And I know that there are folks who are working now to try to help to build more union capacity in, battery factories as well as EV factories, and that will make that will make a big difference.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I would definitely also not like I would think about ways in which you can build community, outside of waiting for electric vehicles to unionize, because that's probably a long process, maybe a wrought one, like a what do they call it, a barbell strategy, where at the one hand you should maybe be thinking about unionizing these things and connecting it, but also how do you, I think part of it is like there's a class and culture clash, and it's not just about fossil fuels. I think part of it is, and I've been in a lot of these conversations. My dissertation research is about people who are producing food for themselves. Part of it, I think, with climate activism specifically, and I don't know if you agree with this, it can be a little bit culturally admonishing, like we know better than you,
Mhm.
we're more educated than you just have to listen to us kind of attitude. And when I did my qualitative studies of people who are doing sort of on the ground food production in a way that's extremely ecologically aware, I found people were able to talk across difference when they were just talking about the practicalities of how do you compost, how do you do how do you, what kind of chickens do you have, and why, and how do you. And so I have taken this what I learned from my dissertation, which was 10 years ago now, or maybe, yeah, 8 years ago, and just thought really hard about how to do things that are practically based and make connections via practical action rather than ideological community building, because I just think the ideological, you have a natural bound on it, if that makes sense. Do
Yeah,
you do
yeah,
you
no,
agree
that
with
makes
that?
sense. I mean, I think that there are a whole bunch of ways that we can think about community building. I think with regard to solidarity, like I talk about lessons learned from the post-George Floyd Black Lives Matter movement in terms of thinking through the way to bring in more people with different identities and orientations. I also talk about the way that the climate justice movement, which is kind of spun off and built off of the environmental justice movement, helps to think through people who are coming from a less privileged place but are thinking about climate justice more specifically. And so we see that, but we just don't see it in the streets as of yet. And that, I believe that that will come certainly as we see and experience more climate shocks.
Yeah, so
So,
let's
yeah.
talk about the climate shocks, as you mentioned that as a second part of your recommendations. Let's talk about, yeah, just
Well,
how do
actually,
you.
I talk about moral shocks, not climate shocks. So those are a little different.
Yeah,
So
okay, yeah, tell me the difference.
Okay, so the second suggestion in the conclusion is that we need to capitalize on moral shocks that include violence against activists. And actually, it's a perfect moment to be talking about this because we're seeing amazing repressive decisions coming down from the UK yesterday and from Russia around against peaceful climate activists who are being given prison sentences starting at like 4 years and going all the way to 21 years for engaging in peaceful nonviolent civil disobedience. The folks in the UK were on a Zoom call. They did a Zoom call talking about planning for climate action on one of the big highways around London, and were sentenced to 4 and 5 years in jail for doing a Zoom call, just for the record. So anyway, when I talk about moral shocks, I'm building off of the literature in social movements that talks about, and I build specifically on the research around the civil rights movement that talks about how civil disobedience, particularly peaceful civil disobedience, frequently is met with repression from law enforcement, from government actors, but then also repression and violence from counter protesters. During the civil rights movement, we saw that in the form of white supremacists who came out and were very violent against civil rights activists, even though they were engaging in peaceful resistance. We're starting to see some of that. We see that in the developing world less than we do in the developed world so far, but I think that is coming. And what I talk about is how building off of the moral shocks of people witnessing the kind of repression and violence against peaceful activists is part of expanding the movement. And that's where moral shocks come in. And that's the role that violence plays. So as I've told many, many folks in the media, I do not expect to see violent climate activism anytime in the near future. I spent a lot of time talking with the groups that are doing the civil disobedience, and none of them are talking about being violent at all. What we do see instead is we see law enforcement becoming more repressive. We saw, for example, the Summer of Heat is an action that's taking place right now in New York City. It's a 12-week mobilization targeting Citibank as well as other big banks that are investing in fossil fuel expansion. And I believe yesterday there was an action where a number of activists who were there connecting the dots between the war in Gaza and fossil fuel expansion. They blocked the entrance to Citibank, and there was some sort of confrontation.
Altercation, yeah.
Yeah, it's confrontation that came from that between an activist who had basically locked himself down so he couldn't be moved, who was blocking the doorway, and a security person, and it became, it started to escalate. And this kind of confrontation between folks who are engaging in peaceful resistance and law enforcement that's getting increasingly frustrated with having to clear spaces where, doorways are blocked, people can't get into their offices, highways are blocked, people are throwing paint, people are throwing food. Those things will escalate. And the point is to capitalize on the shocks that the general public experiences when they see this kind of repression against peaceful activists. And that's one of the tools that the civil rights movement used really effectively during its period of struggle.
How do you square the kind of frustration of that I've heard of, like the working class who are, being blocked on their way to work when highways are blocked with the climate protests?
First and foremost, I mean, there's anecdotal discussions about sometimes working class people who are blocked on their way to work, but most examples are, I haven't seen any research that talks about that. In fact, what I have seen more is if you look at research out of Europe, most of the highway blockage is coming from farmers who are most definitely working class, and they are really quite supported when they are blocking traffic.
Right. Yeah, okay? That's true. No,
No, I just want to clarify here. If we're going to criticize people who are blocking roads, the people who are on the streets, first of all, you need to have data on that. We don't actually have data on that. So claiming that those people are working class versus not working class, it's hard to say.
Oh, well, right? Just anyone, anyone trying to get anywhere. Like I live in Chicago and the highway is blocked, and it's like people I know can't get somewhere. And so blocking the highway it's controversial. So I just want
it's absolutely controversial. I mean, the argument that I make when I talk about this is, that activists are going to pull out all the tools in their toolboxes right now to try to draw attention to the climate crisis. And some of them are going to not work, and some of them are going to work. Some of them are going to be annoying, and some of them aren't going to be annoying. But at this point, given the crisis and the level of the crisis, slowing down on your way to work is not okay. I mean, there have been examples of people who have been trying to get to the hospital, needed to get to the hospital, who were blocked. However, I also have seen examples of when the activists moved out of the way to let them through. Most of the activism we're seeing right now is actually not targeting the general public. It's more like, for example, the work that's happening right now, this activism and mobilization targeting Citibank, and it's not targeting working class people at all. It's actually targeting a bunch of folks who are bankers at the Citibank headquarters. And
Yeah, and
I was there a week ago, and I can tell you the people who were going into their offices, none of those folks were working class folks. Those were
no,
people that, yeah,
certainly,
yeah. I mean,
certainly.
and
So
that's where most of the mobilization is focused right now.
yeah, and then is there any discussion in, the kinds of research that you've been doing with climate activists on the efficacy of the, throwing paint, throwing food, type work that's been
Yeah,
done?
actually, so colleagues of mine and I published a piece in Nature magazine in November specifically on this subject. So there's a lot, I mean, there's a lot we know and there's a lot we don't know, but there is a lot of evidence that this kind of a radical flank, while it's not popular, it's never popular. It wasn't popular during the civil rights movement. It wasn't popular during the struggle for women's suffrage. It's not popular now. Is very effective in terms of creating issue saliency and also working in a radical flank effect to actually motivate moderates or support for the moderate flank of the movement. And we're seeing that now, just like we saw that during the civil rights movement and other movements.
Like
So
sort of raising awareness of the issue and
no, it's not just raising the awareness of the issue. It's actually basically mobilizing sympathizers to support moderate flanks of the movement. So basically, people who see people throwing food and say, oh, or gluing themselves or whatever, and say, you know what, I don't support that, but we need to do something about climate change. And they join, Moms Clean Air Force to work on getting electric buses in their communities,
got
or
it.
they join, some other environmental stewardship group that's, planting gardens,
Got
planting
it. Got
trees,
it.
etc. Yeah,
Okay, so
that's
you
how it
have
works.
seen some of that. Interesting.
Oh yeah,
Um,
that's worked. I mean, and that's documented around the world.
okay, cool. So, is there anything else you want to talk about with moral shocks before we move on to the third?
No, I think that's a important one. I mean, I think that one of the things we're seeing with these new decisions and the increasingly draconian ways that governments are responding to peaceful resistance is that, well, we're going to see more escalation of activism and tactics. I mean, we saw it this summer, or not this summer, this spring on college campuses around the war in Gaza, which is not climate activists, but as I said, I study activism of all sorts. So we saw that with regard to escalation. And just worth noting that the types of encampments that we saw this past spring were nothing compared to the types of encampments that existed during the Occupy movement or during the student movements against, with regard to the civil rights movement or the environmental movement during the 60s and 70s. And yet, during that period of time, you needed to blow up a building before you called in the police or the National Guard. But that's not the case anymore. And that's the way repression works, right? Is that the government pushes back in repressive ways and basically limits people's ability to express themselves, even when they're expressing themselves peacefully, right? So
Mhm.
sitting down on a green in the middle of campus is, it is like officially illegal, but that's a form of peaceful resistance.
Right, right, yeah.
Yeah.
So well, just let's circle back around to this a second. Do you have any data on, I know you just mentioned that like the issue salience maybe increases with the radical flank, maybe to people who are already kind of sympathetic, but maybe not active until they see that, and then maybe they start to get more active. Is there any data that you're bringing in real coalition outsiders with this kind of more radical flank, or are you alienating people? Like, is there any
Well,
evidence one way or
the
another?
research, I mean, you should just read my piece from Nature, but basically the research shows, so the radical flank is not intended to, and it's not documented to bring in outsiders. It never changes hearts and minds. And there's extensive research on this around other movements, including probably the best documented is the civil rights movement. And there's tons of classical sociological and political science research that talks about this. In the climate movement, we see the exact same dynamic. Like a radical flank is not designed to change hearts and minds. It's there to get media attention, which helps increase issue salience, not amongst a sector of the society, but rather by using the media to get the information out into the public sphere more. But one of the effects of that is that it draws in more sympathizers to support moderate components of the movement. And
Right. Okay.
that's how the radical flank works. It's how it worked in all movements. That's how it's working in the climate movement. And I talk about that in the book. I've written about it a bunch of other places as well.
Okay. Yeah, I was just wondering if there was any data of if it brought in sympathizers, but then polarized non-sympathizers.
But like as I said before, there's no expectation. Like you can't say that it's polarizing people who already don't believe climate change is anthropogenic, right?
Well, I'm just saying, make them even less sympathetic to becoming part of the movement
Well,
or
I can tell you
opening
from
them up.
having, I mean, I have looked at a lot of those public opinion surveys. I don't do that kind of public opinion research, but when somebody says they strongly disagree about climate change, you already have an extreme view, so it's not polarizing when somebody then takes on, uses activism to try to get you you can't have a stronger position, right?
Right. Yeah. So yeah,
So
I
so it's not
understand that.
polarizing because it's already polarized.
Yeah, yeah, got it. Okay, that makes sense to me. Yeah, the part of this podcast is really trying to think practically about what you say here about bringing in, working class or people who are diverse ideologically, and so that's why I asked those questions.
Oh yeah,
What?
so I mean, but coalition building and this expansion of the tent is really, I mean, first of all, you can expand the tent by bringing in more sympathizers who are people who are sympathetic to the issue but are not yet mobilized in the movement, or community building, which is much more about drawing connections amongst other activated individuals who are involved in other movements. The other way to do this is actually through this cultivation of resilience, which
Yeah,
goes
let's
much
get to
farther
that.
than that. Yeah, I mean,
Right.
and there it's really, historically we've seen people build strong, ties within communities using religious associations through
Yeah,
schools.
you
One of
mentioned
the
that. Yeah.
yeah, one of the things that I've spent a lot of time thinking about recently is the role that libraries can play in
Yeah.
cultivating resilience. If we think back to COVID and the pandemic, which, I have a friend who has COVID right now. In fact, our president has COVID right now as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
The libraries continue, at least our libraries here continue to provide COVID test kits as well as PPE. They do a lot more than just give you the opportunity to take out books. And so those are places where climate information, as well as information about how to create more resilient communities, could easily be disseminated. And we have a project that we're developing in the DC area to help with that.
Yeah, the one thing that we've talked a little bit about on this podcast is like tool libraries and seed libraries. That's another
Exactly.
way in which libraries can be used as infrastructure for sure.
Right. I mean,
Yeah,
and obviously like dealing with making your community more resilient and capable of handling, for example, floods, right? So obviously nature-based solutions, including planting trees, planting rain gardens, all sorts of things are the kind of information that you easily could get through a library. So I think that lots of people need to spend more time thinking about how to take advantage of those kinds of resources in their communities.
yeah, definitely. So, just to be clear, that third part is really the focus of this podcast, and I know that that was just one small part of your book, and which was more focused on activism and thinking about activism. But that I guess we're coming full circle from the apocalyptic optimism to doomer optimism, which the doomer optimism thing really got influenced by my dissertation, which was how can we cultivate resilience in a way that's not necessarily like you need to be part of some ideological orthodoxy to participate. You can just want a rain garden and you can just want to mitigate flooding in your around your house, and you can learn about that, and then that's like a real ecosystem service. It's a great solution. It's a way in which people can connect with nature, and so those are the kinds of things we explore on the podcast. It's not necessarily your research and wheelhouse, but that's just to get to know one another.
Yeah.
That cultivating resilience part is the part we're most interested in.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked on environmental stewardship with the U.S. Forest Service for about 20 years now. We did a whole bunch of work in New York City when I was on the faculty at Columbia University. We wrote a book called Urban Environmental Stewardship and Civic Engagement, which used the case study of the Million Trees Initiative, which is a nature-based solution of planting 1 million trees in an urban area to address the heat island effect, as well as to address extreme flooding in certain communities. So yeah, I've done a lot of work around this that's not just in the book. It's just that in the book here, cultivating resilience is part of one of the ways that we can all think about working on saving ourselves from the climate crisis. And so that's what I talk about in the book.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's great. If there's anything else you want to mention, specifically on cultivating resilience, I know we kind of stopped short a little bit on like the American Climate Corps and what kinds of stuff the U.S. Forest Service is interested in doing now. Like that, to me, I know this, it's not necessarily the focus of this book, but it's kind of where your mind goes when you get to the end of your book, which is
Sure.
what's next? What are the practical actions? How can I get involved? How can I support this kind of thing? Who do I
Well,
vote for to get this thing to keep happening? So maybe we could talk about that kind
Well,
of
I mean,
stuff.
I think instead of talking about the election, what I'll say is that, well, I mean, we do know that there's one person on the ballot who will be on the ballot in November who doesn't believe that climate change is real and who basically wants to expand fossil fuel extraction.
Yeah,
That's not going to address the climate crisis. It's going to make it worse. It's extremely well documented. And as a social scientist who works on this issue, not somebody who's doing the climate modeling, I'll just point you towards tons of research that shows how bad it will get if we continue to extract and burn fossil fuels. But what I will say is that when we think about cultivating resilience, I want to point out here that the American Climate Corps is an unfunded federal program from the White House. As such, if there is a change in administration, that program will disappear. It will be gone by January. However, all of these programs that I'm studying that are coming from the agencies that are actually building on existing programs to cultivate resilience in actual communities around the country through national parks, through US forests, as well as well beyond that, those programs are going to continue. They're already funded. They're funded through a whole bunch of different mechanisms that are congressionally approved. And as such, I think it's really important for everybody to know that there are not only opportunities for us all to recognize that our federal government is doing these kinds of actions, but also for young people to recognize that there are paid jobs in the
right.
federal government to do this kind of work. And in many cases, those jobs actually give you an entry point into the federal government and the federal workforce, which is really,
Nice place
well-paying,
to be.
good
Yeah, nice
work.
job to
Yeah,
have, right?
especially if you want to do work around the environment. In terms of the kind of jobs that exist or the kinds of resilience work that's taking place, I mean, it really runs the gamut. I mean, there are some programs that are working on building weatherization, which basically means that buildings are more efficient, therefore they burn less fossil fuels to stay warm or
Love that.
stay cool, depending
Yep.
on the time of the year. There are programs that are training young people in how to install renewable energy, particularly solar panels and solar energy. Um, there are also many, many programs that are about creating, more resilience in urban areas and in communities so that when communities are hit with climate shocks, they are able to endure the climate shocks more and recover from them more quickly. Those include gardens, food system expansion, but also things like helping with aftercare programs so that families who, lose electricity have a place for their kids to go,
Mhm.
having, more access to cooling areas during,
Heat
times when we have
waves.
like heat waves, heat domes, making sure there's clean water available, making sure that people have what they need, in the case of a drought, in the case of a wildfire, all of these types of programs. I mean, a lot of it also is about rebuilding after disaster, right? So many of these programs work with FEMA or work with what they call the FEMA Corps, and they come out and help the communities recover and respond. Responding is all about cleaning up right after the mess. A lot of it is mucking and guttings of buildings and structures, which, is really unglamorous work, but
Right.
is absolutely necessary because otherwise, you can't live in a house that's been flooded without mucking and gutting it because
Yeah.
otherwise you're living in a mold, like in a mold zone, right? And
Right.
it doesn't work.
Right.
So,
Right.
yeah, so all of that is part of the work that folks who are involved in different climate corps across the country, many of which are being branded as the American Climate Corps today.
Mm.
And it is very much an opportunity both for young people to get money to pay for college and pay for graduate school or to pay back loans for those things.
Mhm.
But in addition to that, to help to cultivate resilience and build like stronger ties within our communities.
I love that. Yeah, I just saw something today, which I want to go check out. There's this park on the Chicago River that is like a wildlife sanctuary park, and they planted all this sort of native grasses and species that are then can clean the water, but it's also, habitat and it's a park and there's all sorts of cool things like that that I'm like, this is the great kind of thing I want to support.
Yep.
I'm wondering, I have two final questions. One is, how do we as listeners support this kind of thing politically? Do we just, get engaged with these kinds of programs where they're available in our communities? How do we support these kinds of programs?
I mean, I think the best thing to do is one, you can get involved, you can support the program, you could volunteer for these programs. There are lots of opportunities like that. If you're a young person, you could look at them for jobs. They provide gap year opportunities. They provide alternatives to going to college through things like there's a bunch of labor oriented Job Corps types programs. They're called actually Job Corps. Many of them are doing climate and environmental resilience type work in these programs. So there are lots of opportunities that way. The other thing you can do is, I mean, it's important to recognize that the two parties are not equal in terms of supporting this kind of service work. So I would suggest, I mean, the best thing I think people could do right now in this election is pay attention to the local elected officials, what
I
they're
was
running
wondering
on.
if you were gonna say that. Like,
Yeah, I mean,
are there ways in which like local, county, municipal politicians also influence the
of course.
implementation
I
of these
mean, many
programs?
of these programs are being coordinated by states. Like we're working with AmeriCorps on a whole bunch of state-led climate corps right now, which are some of them, but not all of them are part of the American Climate Corps because it's just a designation and name alone, and it has to do with who was willing to sign up when they said
Right.
it was time to sign up. But these climate corps are absolutely valuable for building out capacity in our communities and in our states. And they're designed by people who live in our, communities in our states. And I think that's super important.
Yeah.
But I would just say that, in terms of thinking about the election, thinking through who is running for local office, who supports these kinds of efforts, and those can be, you don't have to be red or blue to care about resilience in your community and responding to, flooding and extreme weather, et cetera, and so forth. Um,
Yep.
but I would, my final point, and this goes back to a lot of the message that's in Saving Ourselves is that one of the ways to think through who to support for local election is to look at the people who are actually practicing what they preach. There are people who say they care about these issues, and there are people who are actually not taking money from the other side.
Mhm.
For
Yep.
example, there's, a lot of groups are pushing for people running for office to take what's called a fossil fuel free pledge or fossil free pledge, which is basically saying you're not going to take fossil fuel money, or in that, and some folks are actually saying you shouldn't take any private money, or sorry, any corporate money to support
Mhm.
your campaign. And there are people, across and up and down the ballots who are committing to that. When people don't take corporate money, they then are much more capable and willing to support whatever the interest is of their constituents. And I think
Mhm.
that that's super valuable to think
Yep.
about.
Yep, definitely. And then my last question was just, I know you talked about moral shocks, but I wonder if you think at all about, and this has come up in my various research and in the podcast, which is the impact of disasters and climate shocks in sort of opening people's minds up to building ecological resilience. Just experiencing that shock is the impetus to sort of shift people's mind toward thinking about these more practical climate solutions,
Well, as
because
the
they're more concerned about the disaster shock, and that maybe they don't even agree. I've seen this too. They don't even agree. I don't know if it's necessarily caused by climate change, like a wildfire, but we need to do some kind of land use policy on this, that these are, that we have to build some sort of resilience in that. Have you seen that kind of thing at all?
I talk about it extensively in chapter 1 of my book. If you look at chapter 1 of the book, I define climate shocks as climate change exacerbated um, extreme events that are, driven by climate change and the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere.
Mhm.
And climate shocks I talk about as playing an extensive role in motivating what we call an anthro shift, which is a shift in different policy actors, or sorry, different social actors in the way they work together to address uh, in this case, climate change. And I also talk about how climate shocks open up windows of opportunities for policy making and social change around the environment.
Yeah,
So,
I was just wondering if you see it at all, not beyond the scope of necessarily climate to something like we have flooding, and so not even connecting it to climate, now I care about, flood mitigation type stuff, or an extreme weather event, I don't connect it to climate necessarily,
but you
but
don't have to connect it to climate if it's connected to climate. I don't you don't it's not about the individual connecting it to make it a climate shock. It is the fact that extreme weather is driven by concentrations of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere that are making sea surface temperature and air temperatures statistically significantly warmer. And that is leading to more extreme weather events of all sorts. And
oh
that's what I'm
yeah,
talking
yeah,
about.
no,
Yeah.
we had a expert on disaster, Elon Kelman. I don't know if you follow his work at all on the
I know,
podcast.
Elon. Yeah.
And he did make a point to make sure that it's not all disasters are climate related. And so
For
he talks a
sure.
lot about that. And so I think part of the coalition building is kind of being realistic about what is climate related and what's not, and
I completely agree. However, my work and the book that we're talking about is about climate change and about climate shocks. And so the movement that I study is driven by those who are responding to the climate crisis.
yeah, sure.
And the
Okay. Yeah.
coalition building that I'm talking about is about connecting it to climate change and climate shocks. So
Got
that
it.
is where
Yeah.
it comes
Yeah.
from.
So
Yeah.
that's the
Yeah.
focus, the scope of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. That sounds
Yeah.
good. All right, great. Is there anything else that I didn't ask that you feel like it would be great to get on the record or you wanted to
No.
say as we close out?
No, I think this is great. And I wanted to thank you for including me. And it's great chatting with you. It's nice to meet you.
Yeah, it's nice to meet you too. And so we can join forces, expand the coalition from the apocalyptic optimists and the doomer optimist
Yeah.
together.
Sounds
So
great.
some coalition building right here happening. So thank you so much, Dana. It was so nice to meet you. I'm really impressed with your work. It's so great. Your book is wonderful, and thank you also for humoring me on talking beyond the scope of your work and the particulars of this book towards my sort of my interest in the podcast. I appreciate you doing that.
No, thank you so much. And also just I'm happy to share with you a discount code for 20% off the book for anybody who's interested that I can share with you through the publisher if you want to post it somehow
Yeah,
when
I'll
this
post
goes
it in the
live.
show description, and it would be also wonderful to get that nature paper you mentioned to
Yeah,
just put in the show notes so that people can refer back to that.
definitely. I will send that to you when we get off the phone.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dana.
Okay.
Have a great one.
Thank you. You too.
Okay, bye. Bye.